Welcome everyone to this week's demo for AttackIQ, an introduction to malware emulation attack graphs. We know everybody's back to back with meetings, so go ahead and grab yourself a water, a coffee, a Red Bull if you're feeling feisty, whatever you need, and we will kick off this presentation in about 2 minutes. We'll see you then. For those of you joining now, welcome. We will be starting in just a moment. Grab a water, grab a coffee, and we're excited to share this presentation with you. We'll be starting in just momentarily. All right, welcome everybody. We're gonna get this show on the road. Thank you for joining us this week for a really fun demo. You do hear my baby in the background singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Don't worry about it, it's all gonna be fine. But we're excited to share this presentation, an introduction to malware emulation attack graphs. And I'm very pleased to present Adam Moore and Ken Town, who are going to be leading us through this. They're gonna introduce themselves briefly. Please enjoy the presentation. Over to you, Adam.
All right, hi, my name is Adam Moore. I joined AttackIQ last summer, and at a high level, I have 16 years experience, primarily in cyber defense operations, cyber threat intelligence, and incident response. And some of my favorite work things are memory forensics, designing defense in-depth architectures and SOC environments to be able to prevent and detect adversaries, and also doing IR against advanced persistent threat actors and conducting cyber intelligence research, tracking those threat actors and understanding their behavioral nuances for emulation that results in tuning of defenses.
Thanks, Adam. And my name is Ken. I'm one of the team leads on Adam's group, focused on adversary research. I joined AttackIQ just at the very end of last year, but prior to that, I've spent the last decade at defense industrial-based companies focused on threat intel, threat actor hunting and tracking, and really love to do malware analysis.
All right, so I've been in the shoes of continuously tuning and waiting for the opportunity to play the next incident response game against an advanced adversary who might return and see if we fare better than last time from a blue team perspective. But sometimes you have to wait years to know how you would do, and that's why I believe in our mission, which is to allow people to continuously tune their defenses by practicing against techniques or adversaries of concern to them, and you can know where you stand at that point. So that's basically the mission, and so the vision. In order to enable that, I lead a group of talented analysts, engineers, and developers at AttackIQ to research the latest adversary behavior to ensure that our content is fresh, relevant, accurately emulated, which is a very complex undertaking overall. And so I'm personally concerned with ensuring accuracy of adversary technique implementation and providing deep value for customers.
And so what we want to talk about today are some malware-focused attack graphs and where this plays in with the AttackIQ tests that we're able to do. Generally, we have three kinds. There's atomic tests. These are general scenarios that you can run in any kind of order that just emulate adversary behavior. There's network-based testing that you can do, which is testing your boundaries, whether or not you can laterally move from one host to another, do certain command and control traffics get blocked. And then finally, our anatomic test engine. What this is a more realistic view of the atomic test. So you can link the different scenarios together, performing various MITRE techniques and their procedures, and mimicking how actors are actually performing their attacks in the kill chain. They can pass information from one another, do different kinds of attacks, and then we can track to see, if one section was prevented, how can I pivot and try to do something else that's related so that I can still achieve my goal. And then we tell you whether or not you're successful. We'll deep dive into one of those so that you can see it in action. Talking about attack graphs and how we've done them historically, there's always been a huge focus on malware, but usually it's coming in the middle of an attack that an actor has done. So the US CERT will publish like an emergency alert about different actors doing things. In this example, one of the Russian actors, when they were using Print Nightmare and disabling multi-factor auth once the invasion of Ukraine started, or maybe we'll deep dive into a specific threat actor. And malware has its role, but that specific actor is doing different techniques for initial access, and then maybe how they're doing their exfil and their follow-on steps. And so what we wanted to do was focus specifically on malware for a couple new attack graphs.
So exactly. So now we have malware-emulation attack graphs, and we'll dive into what they are. But first, I wanted to touch on why we made them. So you may have noticed that oftentimes OSINT is light on details such as the P in TTP or the procedural implementation of a technique. Oftentimes OSINT reporting stops at identification of the technique. They also don't always have them in any order that they actually happened in during an intrusion. And so without our own incident response data and oftentimes just the detailed open source reporting is often infrequent. So we needed a hard data cornerstone to fill in that gap. And so what the differentiator is between this and previous categories of sources for attack graphs is we can analyze full featured malware, and all the procedural details are there as far as how the features and capabilities of the malware are implemented through the lens of MITRE ATT&CK. And malware is central to intrusions, and I feel like is often glossed over in cyber incident reporting. And so sometimes you'll see cyber incident reporting that just talks at a high level about a whole campaign or an intrusion, and then sometimes you'll have malware analysis reports that are missing the larger context. So, and then sometimes there's just no reporting or not much reporting at all on a particular adversary that you might be interested in, that maybe a particular adversary targets you, but there's just not a lot to go on as far as how they behave. So in order to solve these problems, I just came up with the idea to reverse engineer malware and kind of decompose its constituent features and capabilities and basically translate those into MITRE ATT&CK technique IDs. So it's malware is often like really full featured and just central to intrusions. So with this way, like even if reporting is light on an adversary, we can find their malware and at least have some idea of what a victim or target org could expect to see on their endpoints and network. So then we emulate it, and you can practice tuning your defenses against the techniques and procedures of the malware in case your AV misses it. So basically we identify core behavior observed in the samples, identify security technologies that can detect and or prevent behavior of specific samples, and then evaluate the efficacy of customer technologies, capabilities, and configurations to detect and or prevent specific malware behavior. And so we're basically now creating attack graphs based on curated specimens of adversary malware and just translating those capabilities into constituent TTPs. So I'll hand it over to Ken, and we'll dive a little bit deeper.
Sure, thanks, Adam. So, the first step is someone on our team, one of our researchers, is going to actually tear apart that sample. We'll run it dynamically, but more importantly, dive into it statically to find out how is it truly performing those individual techniques. It's one thing to say that a certain malware family uses WMI or they make changes to the registry. It's another to know exactly how they're doing it. Are they launching the reg executable? Are they doing it via the Windows API? Are they setting up a batch script to do that? And we really care about accuracy here. We want to make sure that our simulations are as close to the actor's behavior so that when you run these tests yourselves, you'll know how you'll truly perform. So that first step is doing that deep dive into the code to find out what they're doing so that we can start pulling together all those techniques and documenting those exact implementation details. Once we have that, we tear apart the malware to go, what is the normal flow that this malware sample would follow? Some malware will do a bunch of reconnaissance activity at the start. Others will immediately go in and make a command and control request and wait for those additional instructions. So we want to start outlining what is it going to look like if this was actually deployed on someone's system. And then we can additionally take the details that come in the form of OSINT reporting, where they are sharing some of the actual details from how an actor performed once they did it. Because once you hit the command and control phase, it now becomes up to the person whose hands are on keyboard. What are they going to do first? Where are they going to move next? So we combine that knowledge of how the malware internally works, plus how it's being used externally, and we turn that into our attack graph. And so at the bottom is just a small representation of what that looks like, how things would ultimately flow together. And now that we know that, we need to translate it for our platform. So to do this, we already have a large library of pre-existing content. We've been doing this for quite a long time, so we do have a lot of coverage for the majority of MITRE techniques that are out there, but maybe the technique that we implemented before isn't the exact way that that actor is doing it here or that this malware family is doing it there. And so in that case, we need to do more bespoke development to make our scenarios as accurate as possible. And AttackIQ is 100% an open platform, so all of these scenarios and the source code behind how they function are available to our customers. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you're going to see what we did for BlackCat. The BlackCat encryption is actually really unique in what they do. It's based using Rust. And so the AES library that they chose to support will use hardware acceleration to do any of the AES encryption. If that hardware acceleration is not available, it defaults back to using software implementation of Cha-Cha 20. So we did this exact same emulation in our own version of doing BlackCat's encryption so that if you do have a system with those capabilities, it will use the AES hardware. If it doesn't, then you'll do exactly as that malware performed. And then after we've put all of that together, this comes out into what we call attack graphs, what MITRE generally calls attack flows. And this is the beginning to end of how an actor's activity will work. When we get into the live demo part, we'll actually deep dive into these individual steps and show you what the logic is doing. But in the screenshot, the little bit of an eye chart here, you can see these red and green links. And what these links are is how the graph will perform if a specific action is prevented. And so what we can do here is if you stop me from setting up persistence via a new service, maybe the malware is going to revert back to and go, okay, well, I'll just use a run key instead. And so we can use that logic to decide when someone would have truly successfully stopped that action. A lot of malware will not just stop just because it couldn't do one thing, they'll move on, and so we try to replicate that. However, if there are hard links where if it failed to do something, it would cause the malware to error out or just stop working, we also perform that way. So if you're good enough, you can stop these things earlier in the attack graph, higher up in the kill chain before you are successful, and we'll show you exactly where you did that. So at this point, I want to take a little bit of a deep dive into the two first malware emulation attack graphs that we've done and the malware families that are behind it. The first one is a rat known as SOGU or PlugX. And this is actually one of my favorites of all time. If you've been in incident response from nation state actors, specifically out of China, you will definitely be familiar with this backdoor. Reporting publicly started coming out in 2012. But prior to that, internal sharing groups had recognized this malware since going back to at least 2008. It's not exclusive to a single actor. It's actually shared amongst many Chinese actors. And you might be asking, well, if this came out in 2012, why is it all that important? Well, the truth is it's still being used today. Just earlier this month, Cisco Talos put out another blog about Mustang Panda, a Chinese threat actor, who is continuing to use PlugX. And if you look backwards from that, you'll find continuous attacks going back from now until 2008, where this malware family continues to be used. And then Adam, did you want to talk a little bit about the specific sample that we analyzed in this case?
Sure. So this particular sample that we analyzed and then turned into an attack graph came from a campaign, a large campaign that spanned from 2020 to 2021, targeting a variety of companies like semiconductor construction, infrastructure development, manufacturing industries, IT service provider, university. So this particular sample came from that campaign, but the portion of it targeting the semiconductor subsector of the high-tech manufacturing sector. And so that's where this one came from. Most recently, the PlugX SOGU malware strain has been linked to targets by Moshin Dragon, APT Group, and they're targeting Central Asian organizations operating in the telecommunications sector. This is also like a month or so ago been seen targeting the South Korean civil aviation sector, which I imagine is linked to China's 14th fifth-year plan, where domestic aviation is showing up, for example. But there's also, a variety of sectors and wide use overall with this type of this malware variant. But what we're looking at here with the variant that in the sample that we analyzed, on the left-hand side, you'll see the self-extracting RAR with the trinity of files for DLL sideloading code injection technique. You'll see that it's got the legitimate EXE, malicious DLL, and the encrypted payload. And on the right side, you'll see it's the malicious DLL loader file.
And I think one of the points that you brought up there of it being used by all those different groups is this is exactly why we started looking at writing attack graphs for the malware itself, because defending against this and all of its capabilities will help protect you against not just one actor, but all those actors that are using this same tool. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention is that a builder for this malware family has been leaked for a long time, so it's not always always going to be exclusively Chinese actors that are sponsored by China, but you do have some like Chinese hacktivists and other Chinese BlackCats that would be using it as well, or anyone else that is familiar with the Chinese language and can work through the builder.
Yeah, excellent point.
Yeah, the second sample that we've done here is the BlackCat ransomware. BlackCat or ALPHV nobilis was first discovered in November of last year and started getting posted by a lot of threat researchers in December. It's a really interesting malware family that can target multiple platforms, including Linux and ESXi. And this is one of the reasons why we've chosen this one is Trend Micro recently reported that in the first quarter, it has moved up to be in the top 10 of ransomware families. And I think that since up to March, there had been like 60 successful connections. So they have some numbers of how they're being detected across like their customer base. So it's definitely showing wide usage. And Adam, if you want to go into a little bit more detail about BlackCat and ransomware as a service and how that plays in for us.
Yeah, so basically, yeah, like you said, BlackCat is sort of a ransomware as a service group, and ALPHV and BlackCat is the sample. Basically, ransomware as a service, and then as of March, it's been reported that over 60 organizations worldwide have been compromised, and the ALPHV blog, they have a blog on the dark web where they sort of shame the victims and publish the data stolen from them. And just some examples I'll just say, I'm not going to call out companies, but there's like a call center in Hong Kong, a meat manufacturing company in France. There's construction equipment dealers in Italy, banks. It's of course all over the place. Just very opportunistic targeting by these types of threat actors.
Thanks. And with it being ransomware as a service, similar to a shared malware builder that multiple groups can have, what you're going to see in BlackCat compromises is the initial intrusions are going to be done by different groups, different cyber criminal groups, different individuals, and all of those groups are potentially going to perform differently when they do those initial compromises. But once they turn over that access to this group or get access to the BlackCat ransomware, that process is now going to be consistent. And so by testing against BlackCat, you are continuing to help protect yourself against a multitude of groups and actors, not just one. And that's why it's important to really go through this sample and what it can and can't do and exactly how it does it. So before I move into the live demo, Adam, was there any last second things you wanted to add in before we take a look at it, these graphs in the platform?
No, you covered it.
All right, cool. All right, I'm gonna have to log back in because I've timed out. Give me 1 second. Gotta do multi-factor. Okay, cool. All right, so inside of our platform, what you want to do in order to get to our attack graphs is we go under our template library. So all of our assessments, this includes those network-based assessments, the atomic assessments, and then these attack graphs that we mentioned. So you can come in here, and in order to get to our new malware emulation attack graphs, the category, you just drop down, go into the filter and say malware and apply. This will bring up both of the graphs that we've just released. And you can get some details about them by clicking into details. And then this is also where you would go and create your assessment. There's a couple of default reports that will get generated as you run these to give you an idea of what went well, what didn't go well, and an executive summary of where your next mitigations need to be. So for someone who's wanting to do this, you would log in, go to your template library, go into the details of the one you want and say create assessment. This will let you know if anyone else in your org has already created an assessment, or you have the option to go ahead and create your own. And once you create an attack graph off a template, it's now unique. Any changes that you make, so additional customizations or steps that you add, will be exclusive to this specific assessment. The original template will remain unmodified so that you can always get back to the base. And so in the top here, we have the steps that are going to be performed. And in this case, the way that this graph is going to start, we're looking at the SOGU or PlugX attack graph. The first thing we're going to do, and we do this for all of our malware emulation ones, is try to save a sample of that malware. The first thing it's going to try to do is download it. Generally, if the malware is being delivered via links, or maybe an actor is compromising website and making them install like a Trojanized version of a software. But in this case, with our delivery, we know that spear phishing leads to links. And in this case, someone tries to download it. So this first scenario is going to download a sample, that exact sample, from our infrastructure. This is going to test both your AV controls on your host as well as any network-based controls that you have in place that might disrupt it. And now we start to branch off. If prevented, we just go ahead and we move on with the rest of the behavior. Because we are using an older known sample, there's a very good chance that your AV is going to block it. And so we don't want to stop there because that's not a realistic representation of what would happen in the real world, because they're likely going to have a newer sample that isn't known, or maybe it's been compressed or obfuscated. But we still want to at least test those controls so that hey, at least if someone tried to bring down something known, it would be prevented. Now, as Adam mentioned, the initial file is a self-extracting RAR. So the next two stages that we write to disk are going to be the actual self-extracting RAR and then the malicious DLL. So this way you're testing your local endpoint controls against just those two samples, against the real samples, and you'd be able to know, was this written, was this prevented at the time of writing it to disk as opposed to in transit? same thing. So if the self-extracting RAR, when it's written to disk, is not prevented, we'll go ahead and try to write the DLL, and then all of that feeds into the next stage of DLL side loading. So as we mentioned, with the self-extracting RAR having that holy trinity, you have a legitimate executable that's going to load the malicious DLL. That malicious DLL loads the actual payload, so in this case, plugx. So we have a scenario that emulates that same kind of DLL side loading, and what this means is there are some executables you see NVIDIA's being used a lot, or even the Microsoft Defender executable, that because of the way that Windows is designed to look for libraries, the very first location it checks is the folder in which the executable exists in. And so I can stop the legitimate file from loading the legitimate libraries just by placing my renamed DLL in its directory. And so that's what we do here. We take a legitimate executable, we feed it one of our malicious samples that are renamed a normal library name, and see if you can prevent it. We then move on to the code injection side. So inside of the process, that DLL is going to decrypt the encrypted file and inject the true malicious code in itself. In order to do that, it has to make some Windows API calls to free up the memory space and copy files in, and then transition control to that. So we test that, and then we move into persistence. So there's two options here that the plugx sample will do. The first is if it has high enough writes, it's going to try to create a service for itself so that it can be rerun after reboot. But if it doesn't have that, then it's going to go ahead and use some of the registry run keys that a user can set so that the malware will at least be launched at startup, and hopefully at some point they'll figure out a way to elevate their privileges. At that point, the next thing that SOGU does is connects in with the command and control server. It does two backups here, or two attempts here. The first thing it's going to do is try to make hard-coded DNS requests through one of the Google DNS servers. They want to try to avoid your internal DNS servers because maybe you already have some blacklisting in place or other security controls. And so in this case, our first attempt is going to try to route through Google a DNS lookup for their infrastructure. In this case, we have some mocked up infrastructure that uses the same kind of long DNS command and control pattern that they use. This way you can test whether or not your network controls are stopping suspicious activity. If they are unable to make that connection through Google, then they will go back to, in worst case scenario, I'm going to try to use your local DNS server. So they'll just route the same kind of traffic through the normal methods that network traffic would go out in your environment. And then from looking at different reporting and seeing what kind of capabilities are available in this sample, we move into two core functions that we see consistently used. The first is keylogging, also known as input capture. So in this case, if there is a user, we're going to try to capture any keystrokes or clipboard that's being used, and then running a command line script for general reconnaissance. This would be your who am I, your IP config, just to get an initial lay of the land. And then we're going to fast forward ahead to what they do at the end, and that's exfiltrating files. So they have a backup command and control mechanism that if DNS just isn't working for them, they'll do it over HTTP. Every one of these scenarios, you can click on the names and you'll get detailed descriptions of what it's doing, what we're trying to do, why what we would consider a prevented or not prevented scenario. Some of them have individual configurations that you can change yourself if you want to change up how things are being done. So if you right-click, go into configure, you have some options. In this case, we're running a batch script to do all of the reconnaissance. You could replace it with your own if you know that they're running different commands. You could replace that bat file with your own very easily without having to do a new scenario. Once you've taken a look here, any scenarios that would need extra configuration would be highlighted in red, and a warning would pop up if you needed to add something. Sometimes you need to give it a little bit of extra detail about your environment so it knows where to go next. But in this case, none of these scenarios actually require any input from our customers to run. So all they have to do then is add an asset. And so once they add an asset, they'll be allowed to start it. Now there's two types of ways that you can run our attack graphs. First is on demand. This is definitely great for the first time you want to run something and test it. And so on demand is basically running this attack graph whenever you want. So you'll say run now, and it will kick off the attack graph against all of the assets that you've selected. The other option is scheduled, and this is where you get into continuous validation. Let's say you know that this graph is testing some of your critical controls and you want those tested every day, every week, every quarter. You can set up that schedule. This is important because our logging is always changing, our tooling is always getting different, and so maybe what was a critical prevention yesterday might not be a critical prevention tomorrow, and you want to be aware as soon as that happens. And this can also help you see like if you've improved over time. So maybe when you were first running this, your current configurations were performing poorly and it was able to make its way all the way through the graph. And so you've made some changes and now you want to see, a month later how you're performing. And so this will keep all of those results and you can compare a history of them. Because these graphs do take some time to run, I'm going to go ahead and jump forward to some pre-existing results. So give me one moment to load up those links because they timed out. So this is going to be an example of running it on demand. So I just ran it against a ton of different hosts that we have in our test environment. These all have varying levels of security controls and configuration. So don't read too much into which ones were successful or not successful, because we do try to make sure that there's an environment where it can get far and we can test all those steps. But I want to jump into just a couple of those findings. The first one I'm going to look at is one that we did not have a prevention control in place for. But we did have some detection going. So when you click into any one of those hosts, and in this case, I've just brought up one of them, the first thing you're going to see is a representation of that graph. Every step that's red is not prevented. So in this case, we were able to fully run this specific scenario and nothing happened with it to stop it from going, and it makes it all the way through. So our graph will highlight the path that was taken. So since none of these were prevented, you don't see the green here moving along. And so through here, we went to the DLL side loading. We successfully did our code injection. We were able to create a new service. So I did not need to go and do my persistence through the registry because I've already been successful there. An actor doesn't need to double up. Our network activity worked fine going through Google, so I didn't need to spiral out and try to go out directly. We have an error here for input capture. That's just because there wasn't a logged in user in this test host. So we don't tell you that you didn't prevent this because it's not a true security block just because someone wasn't logged in. So in this case, we just let you know that that's something else that happened here. And so we moved in and did the rest of the steps, and all of these were successful. So just because something is successful doesn't mean we'll leave you empty-handed. Every one of these steps or inside the scenarios, we have a full activity details. These will give you like logging, verbose logging of what was actually performed on that host and the details behind it. If you were expecting to mitigate this and maybe you didn't, we offer some recommendations of where you should be checking and things that you should be concerned about. If you had detection, we show those details, which I'll go into for one later on, but we also provide all of the indicators of compromise. And so the exact steps that we perform, the exact files, hashes, the domains, the IPs, everything that was used in every one of those scenarios we call out. This way you can go back to your SIM or you can go back to that EDR platform and try to find what exactly did we see and maybe why didn't we prevent this. So I'm going to go look at this one right here. And so on this first column is the prevented status, and the second column is the detected status. And so in this case, this one was not prevented, but Microsoft Defender did detect it. And when we go in the detection details, we can expand out and we can see that they did have an alert on there, suspicious system service discovery, a known tool or technique was used to gather information coming from a service. So this will tell you, and you can actually get links back into like the security center to find out like what were the real logs that were related to that. Same kind of thing, the full indicators of what process was actually created get listed for you. Now on the prevention side, the graph looks a little bit different. So in this case, we did all of the malware and all of that was successful. We did our DLL side loading and that was okay. But once we attempted to do the code injection of the malicious, the real malicious payload, the security control actually stopped this. And this is one of those situations where this would be a true killer for the malware, because at this point, all it's trying to do is load up your encrypted payload. And if it can't do that, it's not going to perform any of the additional steps. And so when you do prevent this, this is the end of that graph. You can go back into the settings and say, hey, run all the steps no matter what, if you truly just want to see how you perform against everything. But this is at least a realistic, give yourself a pat on the back. You have the right security controls in place, and you stopped all of the follow-on actions that could have or would have occurred if an actor was there. And the same kind of details are available under the prevented. When we look at the activity details, depending on how that scenario is worked, sometimes a security tool will just eat up the files that we're trying to use. In that case, we're just saying, hey, we can't find the file that we wrote down. Something has modified it or done something to prevent it. Every scenario will function differently, as they each have their own kind of prevention logic and control. So those full details would be available. And as I mentioned, if you go into the details of the original scenario, we tell you like what we would consider successful, use of or execution of that technique. So that's it as far as diving into these attack graphs. As far as like things that we have coming out, our team releases blogs for all of the attack graph content that we do. We have one coming out for both of these malware emulation plans, malware emulation attack graphs. Not only do we specifically call out every step in that blog that we perform, we say why an actor is trying to do this, how that sample is doing it, and then we also offer some recommendations for detection or mitigation. We give you Sigma rules that you can translate and try to put into your own SIMs to find this stuff. And we want to make sure that you have everything that you need to stop these guys from getting where they want to go. And then last off, we do have a white paper if you aren't familiar at all with attack graphs and like how that relates to MITRE ATT&CK and using like our platform here. You can go onto our site and get the white paper, and we walk through like what's the real intent, why do you want to do this, how can you do it, how do you measure success. So with that, Adam, I'll turn it back to you to see if you have any final suggestions.
No, that's all. I think that covered it really well. And I'm just not sure if there's any questions from the audience.
I'm taking a look. Looks like no questions at the moment. However, we always let our guests know if you have questions you think of later on, 3 a.m., whatever, that you wish you would have asked our panel here. Please always feel free to reach out to us. But looks like we're clear at the moment.
All right. All right.
Well, thank you all so much for attending. This was a great presentation. Again, if you have questions, please do feel free to reach out. Until then, be well, and I hope you join us again for another demo. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Ken. And thank you to our guests.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.